The world's highest security prison, CECOT, the most evil are kept here. The air in El Salvador trembles with fear at the mere mention of one name, CECOT. Officially called the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, it is not just a prison. It is a fortress built to hold the most dangerous, the most feared, the men who once ruled entire cities through blood and terror. People say that once you step inside CECOT, you no longer exist. For the prisoners, time stops. For the world outside, it is a reminder of how far a society will go to protect itself from pure evil. But behind the walls of concrete, steel, and silence, there are stories of broken men, hardened criminals, desperate families, and officers who face the impossible task of holding back darkness without letting it consume them. This is not just the story of a prison. It is the story of human choices, choices that lead to crime, punishment, redemption, or eternal damnation. It begins with one man, Miguel. Once a simple boy growing up in the barrios of San Salvador, Miguel's childhood was stolen by the violence that engulfed his neighborhood. His father abandoned him, his mother worked endlessly to put food on the table, and the streets became his teachers. At the age of 12, he was recruited by a local gang. By 16, he had blood on his hands. By 20, he was known as El Fuego, the Fire, a ruthless enforcer feared by enemies and adored by those who lived under his protection. But every fire eventually burns itself out. Miguel's came when the government launched the largest crackdown in the nation's history. Thousands of soldiers swept through the streets, rounding up anyone with ties to the gangs. One morning, before the sun rose, soldiers stormed Miguel's hideout. He didn't resist. For the first time in years, he felt tired, not of running, not of hiding, but of himself. The trial was short, the evidence was overwhelming, and within weeks, Miguel was sent to CECOT, the prison built for men like him. The first moment he saw the prison, he felt a chill. From a distance, it looked like something out of another world, a city of steel and concrete, surrounded by walls higher than any building in his neighborhood. Guard towers stood like watchful eyes, scanning the horizon. Soldiers patrolled every inch. The message was clear: escape was impossible. Inside, he was stripped of his identity. His tattoos, once symbols of pride, became targets for constant surveillance. His name disappeared. He was now only a number. CECOT was designed to break men. Prisoners were kept in cells with little light, no privacy, and constant monitoring. There were no calls, no visits, no human warmth. Meals were given in silence. Movement was controlled like a machine. For many, the punishment was not just imprisonment, it was erasure. But what made CECOT different was not just its walls or its soldiers. It was the silence. The gangs that once roared through the streets with guns and fire were silent here. Leaders who commanded hundreds now sat alone in cold cells, powerless. It was as if the outside world had finally reclaimed its voice, while inside, evil had been muted. Miguel found himself battling not guards, not rival gangs, but his own mind. The silence forced him to hear thoughts he had long buried, the cries of his victims, the pain of his mother, the dreams of the boy he once was. In the stillness of CECOT, the ghosts of his past were louder than ever. Among the guards was a man named Officer Ramirez. Unlike many who saw the prisoners only as monsters, Ramirez believed something deeper. He had lost his own brother to gang violence years ago, and though part of him wanted revenge, another part whispered that cycles of hate could never heal wounds. To him, every man in CECOT was guilty, but not every man was beyond redemption. One night, while making rounds, Ramirez noticed Miguel awake in his cell, staring at the wall. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, not sympathy, not forgiveness, but recognition. Ramirez saw in Miguel the broken boy who had once been forced into choices too heavy for his small shoulders. Miguel saw in Ramirez the pain of a victim, the pain he had caused countless times. Over weeks, they began to exchange words. At first, it was small, questions about food, routine, the outside world. But soon, their conversations deepened. Ramirez told him about his brother, about the hole his death had left in his family. Miguel listened, each word cutting deeper into his heart. And when Miguel finally spoke, it wasn't as El Fuego, the gang leader, but as Miguel, the son, the boy, the man who had lost himself to violence. Through those conversations, Miguel began to change. In the silence of CECOT, he started writing letters to his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, letters to the families of his victims, though he could never send them, letters to the boy he once was, telling him to turn away before it was too late. But change in CECOT was dangerous. Many prisoners clung to their gang loyalty, even behind bars. They saw Miguel's silence, his withdrawal, as weakness. Whispers began, accusations that he was betraying them, turning soft. One night, tension erupted. A group of inmates cornered him in the yard, their eyes filled with fury. Miguel braced himself, knowing this might be his end. Before the attack could begin, guards intervened. Ramirez was among them. Later, when Miguel sat in his cell, bruised but alive, Ramirez spoke to him through the bars. "Every choice has a price," he said quietly. "But some choices build, while others destroy. Which kind will you make now?" It was in that moment Miguel realized the truth. He might never leave CECOT. He might never see freedom. But within those walls, he still had power, the power to choose who he would be, even in chains. Days turned into months. Miguel became a quiet figure in the prison, not feared as before, but respected for his calm. Younger prisoners, those who still carried the fire of rage, began to notice. Slowly, they came to him, not as soldiers to a commander, but as lost boys searching for guidance. Miguel spoke not of power, not of revenge, but of the emptiness violence left behind. He told them the truth, that the path they had chosen led only here, to silence and steel. Outside, CECOT became a symbol. For some, it was a victory, a sign that the nation had finally tamed its demons. For others, it was a warning, a reminder of how fragile freedom was, and how close society always stood to the edge of chaos. And yet, within those walls, something unexpected was happening. Amid the harshest punishments, the deepest isolation, tiny seeds of change were being planted, not by programs or policies, but by the simple act of a man choosing to face his past. Years later, when Miguel's name was spoken, it was no longer with fear. It was with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. Some saw him as proof that even the worst could remember their humanity. Others doubted his sincerity. But for Ramirez, the man who had once seen only monsters, Miguel was proof that darkness was never absolute. CECOT will always be remembered as the place where the most evil were kept. Its walls will stand as long as fear exists in the human heart. But hidden in its silence are stories, stories like Miguel's, that remind us of something greater. Even in the darkest corners, a spark of light can still survive. And perhaps that is the true lesson of CECOT. It is not just about locking away evil. It is about remembering that every choice shapes not only the one who makes it, but the world around them. That even in a place built for punishment, redemption can whisper, if only someone chooses to listen. The first nights in CECOT were the hardest for Miguel. Sleep was nearly impossible. The silence pressed down like a weight, and when silence was broken, it was only by the clanging of iron doors or the heavy boots of soldiers making their rounds. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, feeling the world shrink around him. For years he had lived like a king in the barrios, feared, respected, obeyed. Now he was nothing but a caged body, stripped of everything, even his name. Memories came rushing back, haunting him when he tried to close his eyes. The faces of those he had hurt, a shopkeeper who had refused to pay, protection, money, a young rival he had beaten half to death, a woman who had screamed for mercy when he pointed a gun at her husband. He had always told himself those memories would fade, but in the suffocating silence of CECOT, they grew louder. Each night he heard whispers that weren't there. Sometimes he would jolt awake, sweat soaking his shirt, convinced he had heard his mother calling his name. Miguel was not the only one. Across the prison, men who had once terrorized entire neighborhoods found themselves stripped of their myths. Tattoos that once carried power now only marked them for surveillance. Their bodies, which once strutted with arrogance, now hunched under the weight of isolation. The gangs that had ruled the outside world found their power meaningless here. There were no guns, no money, no neighborhoods to control. There was only stone, steel, and silence. Yet, even here, the invisible war continued. The gangs never truly disappeared. Messages traveled in ways no one could fully trace, through smuggled notes, coded gestures, even the smallest exchange of words during meal distribution. Loyalties were tested. Defiance brewed in secret. Miguel saw it in the eyes of the younger inmates. They still carried that fire, the rage he had once known. They whispered of revenge, of escape, of reclaiming their pride. Miguel wanted no part of it. But turning away was dangerous. In the world he came from, neutrality was weakness, and weakness was death. The younger men began to question him. "What happened to you?" El fuego? They asked, mocking. Did the fire burn out? He didn't answer. Silence was his only shield, though it made him a target. The only light in those months was Officer Ramirez. He wasn't like the others. Many guards treated the prisoners like animals, barking orders, sometimes using their power to humiliate. But Ramirez carried himself differently. He was firm, but never cruel. His eyes, though hardened by years of grief, still held something human. For reasons Miguel couldn't explain, he found himself looking forward to those brief moments when Ramirez walked past his cell. One afternoon, as Ramirez distributed food trays, Miguel finally spoke. His voice cracked from disuse. Do you ever think they can change? Ramirez paused, surprised. Who? Miguel gestured toward the rows of cells, toward himself. Us. Men like me. Ramirez stared at him for a long time. Change is a choice, he said finally. But choices don't erase what's been done. The question is, are you willing to pay the price of that choice? He walked away, leaving Miguel with words that clung to him like chains. That night, Miguel thought of his mother. He hadn't seen her in years. The last memory he carried was of her standing in the doorway of their crumbling home, tears streaming down her face as he walked away to join the gang. She had begged him not to go, but he had laughed, proud of the tattoos inked across his chest, proud of the power that awaited him. Now, in the emptiness of his cell, he wondered if she was still alive, if she still prayed for him, or if she had erased his name from her heart. The next morning, something inside him shifted. He took the small scrap of paper hidden under his mattress, a torn piece of packaging from a food tray, and began to write. The pencil was dull, the space was limited, but his words poured out. He wrote to his mother. He wrote apologies he had never spoken. He wrote confessions he had never admitted, even to himself. When the paper filled, he folded it neatly and tucked it under his pillow. He knew it would never reach her, but writing it was the first breath of freedom he had felt in years. Over time, writing became his lifeline. He wrote to the families of men he had harmed, even though he knew the letters would never leave his cell. He wrote to the boy he had once been, telling him to run from the life that had devoured him. And slowly, word spread among the prisoners. Miguel, the feared El Fuego, was changing. Some mocked him, others grew curious, and then, one by one, the younger inmates began to approach him quietly. Why do you write? One asked. Miguel looked at the boy, barely 19, tattoos fresh on his skin, eyes still burning with anger. Because if I don't, Miguel answered softly, the silence will eat me alive. The boy didn't laugh, he only nodded, and a few days later, Miguel saw him scratching words onto his own piece of paper. It was a small thing, but in CECOT, small things mattered. Still, not everyone welcomed Miguel's transformation. The leaders of his old gang saw his silence as betrayal. One night, during yard time, 3 men surrounded him. Their eyes were filled with the old fire. You forgot who you are, one hissed. You think you're different. You're nothing without us. Miguel stood still. For the first time in his life, he didn't raise his fists. Maybe you're right, he said. But I won't go back. They lunged at him, fists flying. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding across his ribs. But before they could finish, guards rushed in. Ramirez was among them. Later, when Miguel lay on his bunk, bruised but breathing, Ramirez appeared at his cell. You chose, he said quietly. And you paid the price. But maybe now they'll see you mean it. From that day, Miguel's role shifted. He was no longer El Fuego, the feared enforcer. He became something else, a voice in the silence. Prisoners who had once avoided him now came to him in secret. Some asked for advice. Some confessed their regrets. Miguel never preached, never claimed to be holy. He only told the truth, that the path of violence ended only in blood, or in chains. Outside the prison, his mother lit a candle every night, whispering prayers into the darkness. She did not know if her son was alive, but in her heart she believed one thing, no one was beyond God's reach. And in the city, people spoke of CECOT with mixed feelings. To many, it was justice, a fortress that had finally broken the gang's hold. To others, it was too harsh, too inhuman. But no one knew what was happening inside, in the quiet corners where men like Miguel were learning, slowly, painfully, that even in the darkest place, a flicker of humanity could survive. Months turned into years, and the walls of CECOT remained unshakable. For most of the world, the prison was a symbol of finality, the place where evil was caged and forgotten. But for those who lived inside, it was something else. It was a mirror, one that forced men to face who they truly were when there was nothing left to hide behind. Miguel had become a quiet figure among the prisoners. He never sought power, yet men listened when he spoke. The younger ones who once mocked him now came to him in secret, asking how he endured the silence, how he found the strength not to give in to rage. He never gave them easy answers. He only told them what he had learned in the hardest way possible, that every life was a chain of choices, and each choice carried a weight heavier than iron bars. But change is fragile. Not every man wanted redemption. Some still clung to hatred, still dreamed of the world they had lost. One night, Miguel heard shouting from another block. A fight had broken out. By the time the guards arrived, one prisoner lay bleeding on the concrete, his body broken by fists meant to remind everyone that power still lived here. Miguel watched in silence, his heart heavy. For every man who reached toward the light, another chose the darkness. That was the truth of CECOT. One afternoon, during inspection, Ramirez stopped at Miguel's cell. His face looked different, tired, older somehow. "You've changed," Ramirez said. "I didn't think it was possible, but you have." Miguel shook his head. "I'm still paying. Every night I see their faces. Every day I remember what I've done. That will never leave me." Ramirez studied him for a moment. "Maybe it shouldn't," he said. "But maybe your punishment can also be a warning. Maybe that's the only way something good can come out of this." A month later, Miguel received a letter. It had taken years, but somehow, through the legal system, through endless approvals, it reached his hands. His mother's handwriting trembled on the page. "My son," it read, "I have prayed for you every night. I do not know the man you are now, but I believe you are still mine. Do not let the darkness win. Even if the world forgets you, I will never forget you." Tears blurred the words as Miguel held the paper to his chest. In all his life, he had never cried for himself. That night, he cried for her. Life in CECOT continued, harsh and unforgiving. But within those walls, Miguel carried a new fire, not the fire of rage that had once burned cities, but a quiet fire of resolve. He would never leave the prison. His name would never be cleared. But if even one boy turned away from the path he had taken because of something he said, something he wrote, then perhaps his life, even behind bars, still had meaning. Years later, when people outside spoke of CECOT, they spoke of it as the place where El Salvador broke its chains of fear. They spoke of soldiers, walls, and silence. But hidden in those stories was another truth, that even in the darkest cage, a man could choose to change. And that is the final lesson of CECOT. Evil can be locked away. Fear can be silenced. But redemption is a door only the prisoner himself can choose to open. And sometimes, against all odds, even the most broken soul dares to turn the key.